today's guest speaker. So Dr. Shaun McCoshum is a landscape ecologist and conservationist with experience working in the arid West, Great Plains, and the Northeast. He received his PhD from Oklahoma State University, where he studied the influences of canola production on invertebrate pollinator communities, and also did extensive work with milkweeds and monarch butterflies. That was followed by a postdoc at Cornell University, where he looked at the impacts of solar fields on pollinators and local ecosystems. Shaun has worked with pollinator habitat restoration and land conservation on a range of scales, from small patio gardens to large acreages. And we're excited to hear what he has to share with us today. So I will hand it over to you, Shaun.
Thank you, Miranda. It's great to be here, everyone. Today, I'm going to talk to you all about some of the work that I've done and some of the ongoing work that I am doing. Currently, I live in Texas and have ongoing research going with the USDA Bee Biology Lab in Logan, Utah, the Texas Parks and Wildlife District, and currently I'm on a project in the Coastal Bend outside of Corpus Christi, where I've recently started a few other projects out here looking at pollinator communities and effects of agriculture. So we'll talk about some of that information, the way agriculture affects pollinator communities, and some of the things that all of us can do if we are large agricultural landowners or small front yard gardeners, that hopefully each piece of information will help improve the habitat quality for pollinators in our area. So let me share my screen, which is always a slow process. I apologize. There we go. Can everybody see the screen?
Yes, we can.
Okay. And the computer's freezing. There we go. Okay, so the title of the talk today is Native Pollinator Ecology, Habitat Requirements and Conservation Actions. Quick note, somebody should hit record because we just talked about that. Throughout the talk, we're going to start off with pollinator importance. If you've been tuning into the other presentations, you've likely heard a lot about this, so I will briefly touch on the importance of pollinators. We'll then move into pollinator landscapes and the threats that pollinators face. Then we'll dive directly into agriculture and pollinators in those landscapes. Then move on to small-scale conservation, aka gardening, and then habitat ecosystems, the ecological resources, and the importance of all of that and how it ties together when we are planting gardens. Lastly, we'll visit some of the pollinator conservation areas in which we're moving forward and the data gaps that we currently know that we have, and then we'll follow up with some questions. So to start off with, pollinators around the globe are responsible for about 35% of crops that require pollination. This doesn't mean that all of those crops that they're pollinating cannot be produced without pollination services, but the 35% of crops that insects do pollinate, they help increase the crop yield. That crop yield increase adds about $163 billion to the global economy. In addition to that, there's a number of crops that require buzz pollination, and that's where the bee gets onto the flower and vibrates the pollen out of the tubes. Honeybees are unable to do that. So when we're talking about crop pollination, we are in fact not mostly talking about honeybees, even though honeybees are an agricultural product brought into agricultural fields to do pollination. However, hatch green chilies, tomatoes, potatoes, all of the hot spicy peppers that we like to eat, not a single one of those can be pollinated by honeybees. Furthermore, watermelons and the majority of the pumpkins and squash family, honeybees are brought in for those, but they don't pollinate those flowers because of the way that they forage, mainly that there are male and female flowers in that family, and the honeybees are either going out and collecting pollen or nectaring, so they can bring back nectar to the hive and create more honey. That behavior means that they're not really pollinating those crops, even though they're brought in quite often. What most likely is happening is the honeybees are harassing the native bees and causing them to move around more, and that increases the pollination events in those agricultural fields. Lastly, crops that are pollinated by any pollinator, it does improve the size, the color, and the shelf life of those agricultural products. So that means the farmer, that means the people consuming it are getting a better product, and more money can be put into our global economy. So pollinators are really important. In addition to our economy, plain and simple, they're a keystone species of the habitats, and that's why we want to protect them, because without bees, we would really lose a lot of the seed set that is required for annuals and even our perennials to move habitats forward from year to year. So when we're looking at the landscape on a global scale, pollinators exist everywhere except for the Arctic Circle and the Antarctic Circle. They exist in the croplands in Oklahoma, which is the picture on the left, ecosystems throughout the Northeast, the tropical forests in Central America, and even our deserts. Surprisingly to most people, our deserts have the most diversity of pollinators. It's thought that's due to the extreme conditions of weather, drought, and the number of plants that exist in the desert ecosystems that has really driven that pollinator community, but we haven't really gathered enough data to make that hypothesis a full theory. Inside of all of these landscapes, pollinators are dealing with predators. They're dealing with parasitoids, nest usurpation, and parasites, as well as bacterial and viral infections, habitat loss, and the addition of chemicals that come with just humans existing and putting chemicals into the world. Oftentimes when we talk about habitat loss, many people think it's like this picture here, where a bulldozer has come in and removed everything that was there. But in reality, habitat loss, direct habitat loss specifically, includes our cities, it includes pavement, and it includes agriculture. It's really anything that we've done that has caused a massive landscape change, that has removed any of the necessary resources for these organisms to survive. For example, in agriculture, before I started doing my PhD, I would have passed a field like this and thought, wow, this is a really great habitat for bees. But the reality is this canola crop is only going to bloom for about 2 to 3 weeks, depending on the rain. And the rest of the year, it looks like this. That soil is tilled with large plows. So nesting in that field is not a viable option. The food that grows there is removed, so there's no forage there without the canola. And the only thing they're left with are the roadsides. So bees might see and be able to forage on the canola while it's in bloom, but the rest of their flight period, they're really left struggling to find food, and that's going to affect next year's and the following year's population. Furthermore, the agricultural industry adds a lot of chemicals. It's part of the process, and these chemicals have a number of deleterious effects on pollinators. So if we take a look at some of the agriculture that's going around in New Mexico, on the left you have agricultural lands just south of Albuquerque along the Rio Grande. And then on the right, you have agricultural lands east of White Sands, where there's a lot more central point pivot irrigation systems. Around the Rio Grande Valley, you have more straight borders and straight line irrigation, which is technically the worst case scenario when it comes to habitat loss because of the amount of area that is affected by the agriculture. With the central point, you still have corners around the circular pivots where bees can potentially have good nesting habitat and some forage. So if we talk about the worst case scenario here in the agricultural sections of the Rio Grande Valley, and we think about bees in their ability to forage from their nest, there was a paper published in 2007 that looked at bee size and how well they were able to forage, or how far they were able to forage from their nest. The researchers looked at the IT span, which is the intertegular space, and it's really just this measurement across the wings. Most people don't need to know about that, but it does correlate with the size of the bee. Our native bees range from the smallest bee in the world, which is Perdita minima, pictured there on the left, to Xylocopa, I believe that one's Mexicanus, one of the larger carpenter bees. Small bees can forage about 100 meters from their nest, so a football field. A mid-sized bee will forage up to 1 kilometer, and then our larger bees, including bumblebees, can forage up to 10 kilometers. But let's ignore this 10-kilometer one because that's the worst case scenario. And if we just take an average point of this size, we can do 1 kilometer and make some assessments and use the 100-kilometer just for a thought exercise. So going back to these lands, taking that worst case scenario in the Rio Grande where the most amount of land conversion has occurred, if we're looking at the larger bees, they would be looking at roughly this much border patch where they would be able to forage throughout their flight season when the crops aren't in bloom. If we move down to an even smaller bee that can do about 1 kilometer, we're looking at much less forage area compared to their natural foraging ability. And then smaller bees are stuck just normally upon one side of the agricultural field, or if they're lucky and they've nested in a corner of the field, then they get an extra one. But this is still an 80% reduction in the amount of area that they could typically forage. And that's going to decrease the amount of offspring they can have, which leads to next year's population. So we would see, and we have seen, a constant decline in our bee populations in these areas. So let's put that back into our agricultural setting. If we're looking at the small bee, you can see they're really not going to be able to get too far. And in these central point pivot areas, they're not going to be able to get into the center of your field, which is bad for any producer. The bees that can't get into the center aren't going to be able to pollinate those crops. Therefore, we're reducing the amount of yield and the shelf life of those products. So we would want to make sure that however we set up our agricultural system, there would be areas for bees to nest and forage that would also allow them to get into the center of our agricultural fields. Luckily, our larger bees that can forage up to 1 kilometer in New Mexico are really going to be able to forage and be able to pollinate inside the interior of the agricultural field, no matter where they're at. And the overall landscapes are going to have patches that exist where they can be nesting and foraging throughout the year. Unfortunately, throughout most of the United States, agricultural lands are so packed together, this isn't the case. And we're looking at the worst case scenario for bees in most counties throughout Oklahoma, Kansas, Nebraska, and Iowa, and a couple other states. So it's really something to think about when we're talking about pollinator conservation, especially in an agricultural system. Furthermore, bees are non-exclusionary when it comes to their territories. And what that means is a bee does not defend where it's foraging like, say, a mountain lion does or a wolf pack does. Instead, you have bees overlapping and foraging in the same area. So our landscape looks way more like this than it does a single foraging bee over a landscape. What this means is the more areas that we have that can support bees around our agricultural areas, the more bees that can make it into the agricultural fields and do pollination services, increasing the crop yield and shelf life of our products. Earlier, I mentioned that just the overall system of agriculture, there's a lot of pesticides that are involved with it. And unfortunately, the more research that we're doing, we are seeing that pesticides, which includes herbicides, fungicides, and insecticides, all of them are harming bees in one way or another. There is direct effects where organisms that are directly exposed to herbicides, fungicides, insecticides die. And then there's indirect effects where it is a sublethal dose or long-lasting effects of it in the environment that's going to harm the bees. A recent paper showed that bumblebees that were sprayed with herbicide and water, the ones that were sprayed with herbicide died in about 2 minutes. Most likely the herbicide itself is not doing this, but herbicide is applied with a surfactant so that the chemical can cling to the plant. Herbicide is rather inefficient without the surfactant, so we can't pull that surfactant out. But we do know that if any bees are foraging in a field when surfactants are being applied or herbicides are being applied, they're most likely going to die if they get exposed. Recent research that I did that was published in 2017 looked at the role of fungicides and the effects on bumblebees. And we found that fungicide concentrations in the water tables directly correlated with range contractions of a number of bees. We then went in and looked at the bees that were collected in those areas and found that a number of the hives that were collected from were infected with diseases, which means that their immune systems were impacted by sublethal exposure to fungicides. Scott McCoshum has continued that research and shown that consistent exposure to fungicide is in fact reducing the immune system of bumblebees, as well as their ability to forage and their ability to create queens in the end. So we are seeing a reduction in bumblebee populations just from the fungicide, in addition to insecticides and herbicides. Insecticides, as we would expect, target insects, and bees are insects. So insecticides on direct exposure at lethal levels will kill bees, and then long-lasting insecticides such as pyrethroids and I'm going to blank on the tobacco-based ones, neonicotinoids. Those are killing bees as well, and when they're sublethal levels, it is decreasing their ability to forage, decreasing their ability to reproduce, and again, leading to long-term declines in slow pace. So to summarize all of this, habitat loss in agriculture is not only the massive landscape conversion that's happening, it's the addition of pesticides, it is the habitat loss from converted lands, which have reduced the sites for nesting, drastically less food for forage, and the increase in pollution. And then there's a vegetation loss, which is creating more exposure to elements. And this is some of the research I've studied here in Corpus Christi while I'm not on this project, because the landscapes out here look a lot like this, and the landowners constantly are mowing. When I was doing research in Oklahoma, similar events were happening. It just never occurred to me that this might be a problem. These areas that are being mowed, the vegetation is so short that not a lot of flowers can grow there. So it's creating more grass-dominated areas in an area that's being affected with herbicide that's causing grass domination to begin with. By reducing the vegetation cover, it's increasing the ground level wind speeds. And in the measurements I've been able to take out here so far using an anemometer, there's about an average 4 meters per second decrease in wind speeds when the area is mowed like this. And that's just being close to the ground. In some cases, there's no decrease at all. However, in the areas that I have sampled where there is vegetation up to a foot tall, or even the natural landscapes, there's about a 95% reduction in the wind speed. High winds over 15 miles per hour, a lot of bees can't forage. And recent research with honeybees showed that even if they can forage, they really don't want to. So they'll stay within the hive, or they'll even stay on the flower and not move as much when the winds are high. So the way to fix this in any agricultural system is wait to mow. It will also help prevent evaporation, because this low vegetation effect is increasing evaporation, soil exposure to the sun, and the soil is drying out. So if we allow some roadside hedgerows to exist, when the wind hits it, will go over. That will create a corridor in which bees can forage. And then when the crops grow in, the bees can forage in the crops, and we can mow the roadsides. So simple fixes to this mowing problem is simply mow after the crops have grown in. And also only mow once a year, because that woody vegetation and even the stems from things like sunflowers and various grasses are used by a number of bees for nesting. In the landscape, in most agricultural fields where that is all removed, we're removing, again, nesting sites, and therefore we have no way for the bees to exist the following year. We can also seed the vegetation strips in the corners of our agricultural fields with floral resources and try and avoid any pesticide application in those areas. Furthermore, we can let trees and shrubs grow around the margins. That will, again, reduce wind speeds, allow for more nesting sites, and provide forage and shelter for our bees, increasing the pollination services that they are providing for free for our crops. And this isn't just to pick on agriculture, for the record. This habitat loss is occurring all over the place. It's occurring on roadsides, it's occurring in our parking lots, as well as our agricultural fields and our lawns and parks. Habitat loss also is indirect. So in the roadsides, again, just by having this removal of trees, we're starting to remove some of the resources. And yes, the bees can nest in other areas if they're stem nesters and forage out in these roadsides, but when mowers come through, that forage is gone. So they have to find food in other places until the flowers can grow back. Habitat conversion is also our pollinator habitats that we are providing. Quite often, we are trying to build these beautiful flower-rich gardens with high biodiversity. And in reality, pollinators are at the bottom of the food chain. They eat plants, and then lots of things eat pollinators. Spiders, wasps, pretty much every predatory insect will eat bees or butterflies if they are given the opportunity. When we create really nice habitats, we're really creating really nice habitats for the things that eat our bees and butterflies. So it's important that we realize that and try and monitor what our parasitoid, predator, and other natural enemies, what their population numbers are inside of these gardens, to really make sure that the pollinator populations are staying healthy and not just being consumed. These are just a sample of some of the parasitoids and predators that are found throughout North America. On the right, we have Pteromalus cassotis, which is a pupal parasitoid of monarch butterflies and presumably queen butterflies. This is a potter wasp that breaks into nests and usurps them. And this is an ambush bug that will just sit and wait at flowers and eat anything that it can capture. And then there's also the problem of people using fungicides and herbicides in their gardens, which can impact our pollinators. So it's for me, I think it's important to start with what are the landscapes that we're trying to emulate when we're talking about our gardens. Quite often, people really like this diverse, beautiful burst of color that you see here, which is common naturally anytime after a fire in a forest or in the plains. Down here is an area that I consulted on for pollinator conservation and seeding, and they were aiming after the just mesquite shrublands that exist in West Texas. Out in California, the Mojave Desert, there's a lot of people who use xeriscaping like this on the outside of their yard, which is trying to emulate the xeriscapes that exist naturally. But you can see that there are resources that are missing, including the dead wood of the yucca, various rock structures, lots of the soil. This is going to have plastic liner on it. And same goes for all of these other things. What's really missing in our gardens is this idea of time, of what did this actually come from, what resources should be there from the previous habitat, and what will happen in time once these plants are allowed to grow from year to year. So when we're talking about ecosystems in a natural versus a managed state, if we're looking at Yosemite where a fire goes through, we expect the prairie to show up and then trees to grow in, versus a managed ecosystem. This picture here is Monet's garden. I think it's from 2018. I saw it off the internet. Here's the same garden painted in 1896 by Monet himself. It hasn't changed very much, and that is not a natural process. The natural world changes quite often, and our habitats change with them. In that change of habitat, that makes the pollinators that would exist with those plants move into new areas. And as the new habitat plant succession occurs, the pollinators that are dependent on those plants can move in. Furthermore, we are also changing and regulating the interval of disturbance. So areas that are being constantly disturbed via mowing or fire or however we want to manage it is going to offset some of those resources and natural processes as well. Overall, we're trying to prioritize the habitat over the ecosystem, and we're not really considering how the populations would have naturally been moving and dealing with the buildup of predators and parasitoids and things that would cause illnesses. In school, a number of people learn about ecosystem succession by this figure, where you have pioneer plants that come in and start to build the soil, then your perennials finally established, and some woody plants, small trees, and then you end up in a climax forest. Unfortunately, this is only going to happen in the real world if there has been a brand new lava flow, an intense landslide, and that's about it. In reality, what we're dealing with is this is a better picture of it. This is a better depiction of what we should be dealing with, but this shows more of a real story where if a lava flow came in, we would deal with these pioneer plants and then start up with this long, slow process of building up to a climax forest. But if there was a natural disaster like a forest fire or a flood, what would happen is really just the exposure of light to the ground. The wood that was growing in the trees that has now died now becomes part of this ecosystem, and those resources are utilized. As this area and start to grow new trees, there's still dead wood in a lot of things that our pollinators are using in resources that wildlife would be using that's just missing in our gardens. So to kind of belabor this point, if we look at a forest fire that occurred in California, you can see the fire burned through but left parts of the forest. So we just have what's called a shifting mosaic of a landscape. That leftover wood is going to allow beetles and various wood-boring insects to be able to live in here, and then they emerge. Those holes are then used by various insects as well, including bees for nesting. We can also see that in a forest fire from 1988, 11 years post-fire, there's still a lot of perennial flowers that have grown up in here and died off for the season, and the trees are starting to colonize. But after 25 years, the tree canopy is starting to be connected and dense. So that means any of the pollinators that would have been dependent on these flowering plants can no longer live here from year to year. So they have to disperse back into the landscape. That's a really important process because it allows them to escape from the predators, the parasitoids, and the illnesses that were building up in that ecosystem. So although this is really pretty, it's only supposed to live for about 25 years, and the pollinators that exist in that area's population should also only be in those areas for about 25 years. So if we're looking at the resources that are missing in our gardens that would naturally exist, not only is fresh wood going to be important, but even as the wood rots, it's being used by insects and various other organisms for purposes of their life cycle. Here's just an old rotten. It was heavily decayed by fungus. And when I was moving it, I broke apart and I found a bald-faced hornet, an agrochlorella bee, all hibernating in the middle of winter. So that decomposing wood is where these organisms were climbing into to experience the winter and survive it. Without this resource in the landscape, these creatures don't have a place to hibernate for the winter. So again, their population can't continue into the next year. If you are gardening and trying to improve areas for pollinators, consider things like this. What existed in the landscape naturally, what's missing, and how can you put it into your garden in a way that doesn't look too terrible and hopefully really nice, that the pollinators can still utilize and continue their populations. Another example besides wood, especially in the areas of New Mexico and West Texas, are the washes. So when storms come through and deposit these barriers of vegetation and twigs, these are going to be important features that we definitely don't see in our urban ecosystems, and we've most likely removed from our agricultural systems too. These are going to be areas like that old rotten log where organisms are going to hide out either in the winter to avoid the cold or even in the summer to avoid the heat. We've also generally removed mesopredators, which are going to build these tunnels via coyotes, skunks, or foxes. The tunnels themselves are going to be used by a number of organisms to get out of the heat in the summer. The freshly removed soil is going to be used by bees and other organisms for nesting and digging into. We haven't really done a lot of research to know how best to improve soils for ground nesting bees. But as I was just saying, with the mesopredators being removed in the fresh soil, those areas in our gardens have been removed. We know that. And if we look at what information we do have about soil nesting bees, Jim Kane produced this paper in 1991. Ignore the family names here. These are no longer correct. They've been synonymized. But all of the bee species that he looked at all nested in this heavily sandy soil, about 50% sand, up to 50% loam, and then some of them have clay percentages as well. If you're trying to improve areas around an agricultural area or in your own garden for soil nesting bees, what I recommend is emulate this soil information. So you should find a place that's not going to collect water, number one, because bees do not nest where they would get drowned. Place your area in an that's uphill and out of the way, so it's not being disturbed by any type of machinery on a daily basis or people walking around. You're going to want to dig out a minimum of 12 inches. Most soil nesting bees dig nests in between 12 and 24 inches. So if you dig a minimum of 12, they'll be able to build their nest adequately in that area. But if you have the skill to get 24 inches into the dirt, go for it. And then you want to fill that hole that you've just created with the amended soil, pack it down, and bees will start nesting there. It's also a good idea to scatter pebbles across this so that bees can see those pebbles and orient themselves as they're coming into land at their nest. Oh, sorry, I should have been first. Soil should be a majority of sand with up to 50% loam and some clay. If you're trying to do stem nesting bees, quite often I see bee hotels for sale. Amazon's always trying to sell them to me because I search for them so often. But in my experience, the majority of these bee hotels are inappropriate for our bees. And that's simply because they're just too short. You can see this one is only 3 inches deep. The way that most stem nesting bees are going to nest is in old beetle holes that occur in dead wood. So here have been some mesquite trees that were cut and we can really see the tunnels. But when the beetles emerge, they leave these holes and then the bees come in, find them, and walk into the tunnel as far as they want to, start their nest, and then work their way out. If we are looking at a cross-section of a stem nest, you have your oldest cells furthest back, and then your youngest cells are in the front. So the oldest cells cannot mature at the same rate as the ones in the front because they would be waiting for these ones to grow up before they can leave the nest. One of the ways the bees have solved this problem is the last couple cells are male and they do mature faster. And then there's a signal that they all send to let them know that they are all mature and ready to leave. When we go too short, if the nest is cut short, what happens is we just have a male-dominated population, which is not natural, not normal, and causes a lot of harassment to the female bees, which we don't want. We want the bee populations to be more natural, which is female-dominated. So if you want to build your own, here is a design I've used for research. It works really well and is easy to take down and remove year to year so that parasites and parasitoids don't build up. If you use an 1/8 inch drill bit, you want to go about 4 inches because the width of your tunnel is going to depend on, or is going to dictate which bees can utilize that tunnel. Simply that smaller bees are going to use smaller tunnels. Therefore, they have smaller cell sizes and don't want to go so deep into the nest blocks. You can push that against another block with 1/2 inch holes, and those want to be 9 inches, and then you want to put a roof on it. Pinch it together. You can use wood glue, you can use clamps, and then hang this up and bees will use it. You do not want to make a dense nesting hotel as seen in these pictures, simply because that's not how it naturally exists. And if one of these nests become infected with pollen mites, those pollen mites can easily climb out and infect the rest of them. Similarly, a parasitizing kleptoparasite bee can just sit here and wait for each bee to leave, go in and lay an egg. And in the 1960s, 1970s, a number of farmers tried to build walls of stem nesting bees like this, and they worked fantastic for about 2 to 3 years. But in all cases, by 5 years, the bee nest walls were absolutely abandoned because of the amount of pathogens that had built up in them. So we don't want to use high density, short tubes, and we want to be able to take them down and clean them or refresh that resource. So the ones that I suggest building, again, are very easy to build and easy to replace. And you're not wasting, $25 to $40 on one of these hotels, which are bad for the bees. So if you want to plan a bee garden, one of the problems I see quite often that a number of gardeners do is they just want to rewild their area, and that oftentimes upsets neighbors. And it was a huge problem in the Northeast. A recent article from Science and Nature is in Chicago, native plant gardeners keep getting ticketed, which is costing them hundreds of dollars for these tickets. And the problem is that they're simply letting the plants go wild in areas where people are expecting to see order. So my recommendation to overcome that hurdle is use landscape architecture ideas, but fill them out with native plants. Here's just a front yard design that I came up with, where you can use a rock border. Borders really help people see that things are being done intentionally. You can hide sections of your garden, so you can amend the soil for bees wherever you want to. If you make a rockscape, that's a great place to put the amended bee soil for. You can hang up nest blocks all around. But again, by creating these distinct patches, you can plant natives there, just organize them better, and your neighbors can see that everything that you're doing is intentional. They may not like it as much, but they can at least argue that it's not a weed patch, that you just stop taking care of your yard, which a number of people like to say is what native pollinator gardens look like. And I disagree, but I want to be a good member of my community. So I always recommend that we organize our yards a little bit better. As you're doing that, like I said, you can incorporate resources as focal points or hide them in plain sight. You can also create ground nesting bee areas around large rocks or in the borders, just pretty much anywhere you don't want people walking, so that the bees aren't being chased out. They're not really going to sting anybody. That's not what native bees do, but trampling their nest is not good for the bees. So if we really take a look at some of the information that's out there with native pollinator gardens and resources on how to conserve our native bees, you'll notice that they're kind of broad. And that's in part because there's a lot that we don't know. Bees are insects, and insects in general make up the majority of biodiversity on the planet. But we also know that about 25% of insect species have not been described. Bees are in that group. The US has about 4,000 species of native bees. More than 300 of those species have one digital record. Even more of them are described by a single specimen caught somewhere. So we don't even know how long of a flight period those bees have. Another problem that we have is before recent years, before really 1995, it wasn't really cared about what bees we had. So there was just a handful of bee biologists, and those handful of bee biologists mostly targeted the Mojave Desert and surrounding areas, although there are a few places in the Northeast where those researchers ended up getting jobs eventually. So we have good sampling of the Mojave Desert and parts of the arid Southwest, as well as a few states in the Northeast. Here's a visualization of that. So if we're taking museum specimen data that's been digitized, you can see the Mojave Desert has a lot of specimens, over 10,000 specimens collected in these counties. And if we add community science data from websites like iNaturalist or any of the projects that various museums have run, we get some counties that start to pick up. Unfortunately, I didn't use the same color ramp as the next slide. So the red here means 0, and there's a lot of counties with 0. But counties aren't really a great example just because they're political boundaries, and some of them are large and some of them are small. So if we break the US down to a grid of 20 square kilometers each pixel, you can see there's a lot of areas that are just not sampled, and a lot of that is within our crop belts throughout the central US. Again, the Mojave Desert has been super well sampled, but you can see it's really around San Bernardino, LA that's been well sampled. There's also an area in southwest New Mexico and Arizona that's been well sampled, and we can zoom in on that. Where these counties in New Mexico seem to be well sampled. And Texas has a couple counties that have 0 records. And again, if we break it down into a digitized or a equal parts plot of 20 square miles, my apologies. Again, we can see all these counties are really being driven just by a couple hotspots. And in this area that I was just talking about where it's well sampled, that's because the American Museum of Natural History has a field station right here in the Chiricahua Mountains. And for the last 20 years has been hosting a bee training, bee identification training camp that lasts for a week. So for the last 20 years, once a week, this area is well sampled. All those specimens are able to be collected by the museum and digitized, which is why we know roughly what's going on in the Chiricahua Mountains, but not the surrounding areas. We can also see from this grid that there's a number of areas in Central Texas that showed up as, adequately sampled that really aren't adequately sampled, as well as parts of New Mexico, in the Northwest and parts of the Northeast. Unfortunately, a lot of our researchers have just gone into areas and sampled and haven't worked with communities. So in these areas, it's really that we need to work with the communities that live in these areas and see how they want to approach understanding the biodiversity of bees in their areas. This is just a highlight of the hotspots of where the samples are really kind of filling out our information when it comes to what we're trying to decide to do with conservation of bees. So you can see we just really don't know a lot about the bee community structure. And then even worse is when we do know the bee community structure, we don't even know necessarily which flowers those bees are foraging on. And we'll touch on that in a little bit. So if you want to help out, and join in some of the public participation, aka citizen science, you can help collect scientific data because it's incredibly important. By every single person going out and helping collect data, we're increasing the number of observers. It's not just one scientist trying to go out and answer questions. We can pool that data and more accurately understand what's going on around the world. Many platforms now exist, which is great. I constantly push iNaturalist over all of the others simply because it is a foundation that was supported by government grants, and it ties into a number of other databases for researchers to be able to cite that data and figure things out, as well as be able to look at the photos. If you're trying to take photos of bees, it's really helpful if you can get a shot of the face, the head, tongue, and the mandibles. Typically, to get the mandibles, the bees have to be pinned. I understand a lot of people do not want to pin bees, so don't feel bad if you can't do that. Or get a picture of the wing venation. A dorsal view of the abdomen and the last few sections of the abdomen are important, as well as the legs, because of the hairs and spines that exist on legs, which help us get to the generic ID. If you're just sitting in front of a flower and trying to get photos, there are a number of bee species that can be identified from photos of foraging bees. Here's a great example of a California digger bee, Anthophora californica. The reason I like iNaturalist is because with our cell phones, if you take a picture, it's geotagged. So that geolocation comes in and is transferred into iNaturalist. It's date stamped. So the date of the observation gets pulled in and the time of the observation. The more that we're studying bees, the more that we're finding out that some species forage early in the morning, some species forage late at night, and some species forage throughout the day. And that's going to be important when it comes to planting, because some flowers like dandelions and false dandelions bloom in the morning and seed out later in the afternoon, where plants such as milkweed are going to produce nectar more in the morning, which dries out by the afternoon. And the more that we understand of these interactions, the better conservation plans we can create in the future. The other thing that's really nice about iNaturalist is you can either type in your notes of everything you think is important, or you can even add fields like nectar plant, or if it was on a milkweed species, and create those fields to help organize and give us more understanding of how these bees are behaving. And we can take that information, like I said, and create better conservation plans. Another issue I have with a lot of the pollinator articles that go out is they suggest what are called workhorse species. And oftentimes these include flowers that are not going to grow in the arid Southwest. For me, I recommend, just as a starter pack, the Arizona lupine, bristle grasses, cowpen daisy, horsetail milkweed, oaks if possible, palmleaf mistflower, prickly pears, strawberry hedgehog cactus, Tahoka daisy, upright prairie coneflower. The reason that I start with these 10 is because the flowers produce a variety of floral structures that different bees can utilize. Oaks are important for a number of lepidopterans, and they also produce a lot of wood and vegetation that can be used in a garden for rebuilding that leaf litter or dead wood structures that various pollinators can use. But this is not something that I'm saying you have to incorporate in your garden. I just know a lot of people like something to start with, and this is a good starter list. Arizona lupin and Tahoka daisy are also really great annuals that self-seed, just as well as cowpen daisy. Cowpen daisy is not a fantastic forage for pollinators. However, most of the pollinators that are generalists will use cowpen daisy if it's the only thing available. So it's a good plant to put down just because it's so resilient. Oh, sorry. And then if you're trying to do non-target plantings, you just want to seed things out. Your flowers should produce your plant should produce flowers throughout the growing season. So you want to also incorporate a wide variety of flower types. And what I mean by flower types are small flowers, big flowers, ones that are really fluffy, ones that are kind of discreet, tubular flowers like you see in the sage, or open like a sunflower or a dandelion. The more diversity of flower texture, size, and shape, the better we will be covering the diet breadth of our pollinators in the area. So when I moved to a house in West Texas last spring, this was the yard, and I just want to cover some of the work that we did. It's still in process, but some of the work we did to create a pollinator-friendly front yard, as well as just a wildlife haven in general. So to start off with, I moved the resources that I had from the balcony of the apartment that I was living in and plants that I had. So this is the first step. I also didn't want to make the yard a mud pit at the very beginning. Unfortunately, where I live, there is a grass ordinance. So we decided to leave the grass underneath the tree and along the side of the house. About May, we were able to tear up the majority of the lawn, lay out the bare bones of what was going on, started to put in the borders, rock borders, so people could see that what we were doing was intentional, create stepped planters because we're on a hill. And over here, you're just seeing the layout of materials. This is how our yard looked by August. So we had strong borders in on the corners. I also used this area to put in amended soils for bees. On the left-hand side, I'm using the second step sand for concrete. On the right-hand side, I'm using the first step sand for concrete. This spring, Apidae, we're nesting over here, and Halictidae, we're nesting over here. So they are picking the areas based on the sand grains, it seems. We also had a number of Halictidae nesting in this bare soil area. I integrated a lot of native plants, including yucca alata. Red yuccas go up this way. Various grasses. Grasses are important for male bees because they are not going to be in a nest. They normally hang out in vegetation. And they also provide seed for some of the birds. Devil's head cactus, lots of varieties of cactus that I was able to rescue before bulldozers went through. Tahoka daisy, horsetail milkweed is planted up here, and tree cholla. The plan is that these areas here will this year get planted with groups of plants that are short for here, such as Asclepias tuberosa, butterfly weed, and then down here a lot more Tahoka daisy and even buffalo grass. And then up here we'll put in some taller plants and continue to have these strong borders. When the yard was cleaned up like this, we had so many compliments from the neighbors the way that it looked, and explaining to them on how this was a really good wildlife front yard got some of our neighbors to move on to doing similar projects in their yards, which is exciting. Versus if we had just left this unmowed, we would have been ticketed by the city ordinance, which would have been less fun and kind of expensive. If you don't want to have a fully vegetated yard, various gravel covers are a good idea. If you use cardboard instead of plastic, The cardboard can be chewed through by a number of pollinators. The plastic cannot. So I recommend using cardboard if you're trying to put down weed liners. Here's just another view of the yard. This is how it started. This is how it looked at the end of August. Unfortunately, I haven't been there the last 2 months because this project I'm in Corpus Christi. So I don't know what my yard looks like right now. But I have had some neighbors tell me the flowers look beautiful. So again, tips for creating a good habitat and keeping your neighbors happy is have clear borders. You can either do it via mowing or through landscaping and creating these rock borders. Keep things most orderly near roads. So anywhere that people can really stand and see, if you have that the most ordered, it makes things look intentional and they can go more wild further in. You can also use shrubs and trees as well as rocks and low-growing herbaceous plants as focal areas for people to see, kind of draw their eyes to those areas. And again, make everything look intentional. An update on this is the native plants that we were putting in were visited within days of blooming by native bees, so they were able to attract them. The amended soils for bees attracted nesting bees within a month, and then this spring we're attracting more bees, which is exciting. And then we've seen a number of other arthropods, as well as birds and even lizards starting to use the yard, which is exciting, just as a biologist, to have those in my front yard. Real quick, paper that should be coming out very soon is on this group of bees called Ashmeadiella. They're really common. They're a small bee, about 1 centimeter long. We know there's more than 5 undescribed species. They are both polylectic, meaning that they forage on lots of different flowers, and oligolectic, meaning they forage on just a few flower species, specifically in 1 or 2 genera. This is roughly what they look like. There are ones with red abdomens, there are ones with yellowish orange, and then full black with a couple stripes, and they have really punctinate skin. But that's not what I really want to touch on. In the areas that we live in, they're rather abundant. They really like the arid Southwest, so you should have them in your yard. And if we look at the flower use of this genus of bees, you can see that some flowers, or some families like Fabaceae and Asteraceae, support a number of species in this genus. However, Cactaceae is only supporting maybe half, even though Cactaceae is going to be rather abundant in the areas that the majority of these species live. You can see from this diagram that some plants are not supporting a lot of bees where other plants are. And the typical conservation momentum at this moment is just plant flowers that are going to do the most good. But at the same time, it is important to plant these less used flowers for those species that are more rare, because we don't want them to go extinct while we're trying to take care of our pollinator communities. So if you ever need a visual reason to really make a good planting biodiversity in your gardens or around your agricultural fields, think of this, where some flowers are going to support 1 or 2 bee species and some flowers are going to support lots of bee species, but all of those bee species are important to the biodiversity of the area and to the ecosystem. To summarize the talk, if you are looking for action items, one of the hardest things let's start on the easy side, start at the bottom. So the easiest thing you can do is simply stop using long-lasting pesticides. Preferably stop using pesticides altogether, but I understand that, we want to keep various insects out of our yard, or spiders out of our yard. We want to keep various plants from growing. So I'm not going to say absolute ban all of it, but reduce your use, but definitely stop using the long-lasting pesticides. Another easy thing you can do is plant basil, mint, lavender, lamb's ears, butterfly weed, cacti, tomatoes, anything that blooms and grows easily pretty much, and native grasses instead of turf lawns. Plant a diversity of native flowers, leave down branches and piles of leaves for insects to carry on their life cycles. What makes it hard is you have to organize this so it doesn't look messy, but is still useful to the bees. A little bit harder is pick a species or groups of species of pollinators that you want to enhance habitat for, and then monitor it annually. Make sure that the things that are eating them or causing them to get sick aren't building up as well. And when those buildups do occur, you want to make sure that you take out the resources that those predators and parasitoids are utilizing, be it a nest box, be it the wide array of flowers. In many cases, simply cutting back your plants and preventing them from flower will make your pollinators find new habitat somewhere else. And the following year, you can let them all grow back and be recolonized by the native plants and native pollinators. The hardest thing to do is identify all of the native habitats that once existed in your area, because it is really difficult to get that information. You can identify which habitats you want to foster and then try and restore those to the best of your ability. Understanding that you're restoring the ecosystem and allowing those habitats to switch back and forth in a natural state. So with that, I hope you all learned something fantastic or something that you can apply to your own yards, and I will take questions.
Thank you so much, Shaun. That was interesting. And I loved how you covered, I can see myself twice. I loved how you covered the ag landscapes and the gardens. Really made it applicable. We do have some questions.
Awesome.
We'll start with the Yasmin had an agriculture related question. Would it be better to create bee habitats around and in fields, or make center pivot areas smaller and more of them?
So that it really just depends on the ability of the landowner to irrigate the field. The central pivots are coming from an aquifer usually, so they have drilled a well, and that is accessing that aquifer and coming up. That round circle, just because of the way our politicians like to draw borders in straight lines, leave the excess areas of that square available for bees. Those areas, especially in East New Mexico, are great for butterflies and great for a wide variety of butterflies and bees, simply because the overall space that's left there for them to carry on their life cycle. The straight borders, if we could widen those out a little bit and then just create larger corners, that would be beneficial as well. Or just leave areas of the irrigated fields to go wild for the bees to nest, just so that we could increase the ability for them to nest and forage when the crops are not in bloom.
Great. I guess this would apply to both landscapes, since we're planting for pollinators everywhere. But when we're planting for pollinators, how can we reduce predators while helping the pollinators?
The best way to reduce predators is, it's a very nuanced question. I'm sorry. So Hansky et al. Were the first ones to kind of touch on this and realize that these really good habitats, which are arguably our gardens, these really good habitats are the ones that foster predator and parasitoid populations. So unfortunately, the best way to create pollinator habitat and reduce predators is to create less biodiversity of flowering plants in the pollinator habitat. So you want to have like a mediocre habitat for the pollinators, because that dissuades the predators from being there or makes them work harder to get to their prey.
And I guess I should mention too, since I do work in the integrated pest management program, that we do want some predators to help manage our insect pests.
Yes.
John's back, so he's gonna help with some questions too.
Hi, thank you. So we had a question about, is spraying for scale on pinon with mineral oil and fatty acid dangerous for bees?
Do you have an answer to that, John? No. Unfortunately, I don't know enough about those chemicals to tell you. However, if they're killing any of the scale insects, they are quite possibly affecting the bees. So the best hybrid scenario in that is make sure that you're only applying it to the scale. Once scale insects are done, wash the plants off, and then that should avoid further contamination in the habitat for the bees to be exposed to it.
Also, since I forgot to mention this, Amanda put a survey in the comments. We'd love your feedback about this presentation and our series. So I'll post the link again, but if you could fill that out. Another question for you, Shaun, is can we get copies of your garden plan and your recommended plant list?
So they'll be in this video, so you can go back to that. I've also recently published a book, which is available on Amazon. It's in there, and then I will hopefully be writing or publishing a new book by the end of next year that will be even more in depth. But the ones that I covered today will be in this presentation, available through your organization, correct, Miranda? Yeah, so you can access it there, or if you're interested in purchasing my book, it's available on Amazon.
Yes, I will be sending the link to the recording to everyone who registered later today. A lot of people Yasmin asked what the title of the book is.
It is.
If you want to put that in the if you want to put a link in the comments in the chat, you can do that too.
Ooh, I don't know how to do that, but yes. Or the chat.
If you answer the title, I'll look it up for you.
It's Arid West Gardening. Sorry, it's Gardening for Wildlife in the Arid West Regions.
You should actually know that when you search gardening for wildlife, it comes up, your name comes up as a suggestion.
Oh.
That's exciting.
Exciting.
We also have a lot of people thanking you and saying they really appreciate the practical information and steps that they can actually implement.
Awesome. I tried to make it so that there were easy action items and more difficult ones based on what your energy level was.
Also, that you were the best. You're the best of our series so far.
You can thank Miranda. I'm actually a stand-in. This is all thrown together very last minute. Miranda's just awesome at doing her job, as well as the staff that put this together.
But I think you covered it so well that we don't have a lot of questions today.
Fabulous. All right, well, feel free to reach out to me. Miranda, you can give everyone my email if you want.
Okay.
And yeah.
Also, someone says your yard is inspirational, which I agree.
Thank you.
Very relevant. Okay. I'm going to stop recording then.